Thank you very much. It looks like this session was about the title of the entire event, Sustainable Investments in Forests for People, Profit and Nature. Very interesting indeed. So I'd like to invite my colleague to be the moderator of the next session, which is called The Future of Forest Investment. So please, Lindo Bull from FAO, you have the floor, and she will be our moderator in this session. She will present the other panelists of the session that's gonna start right now.
Thanks, Natalia. Mokina and Sham, do you want to come up? Ludwig, you may as well come up now too. Yep. Hello. Nice to see you. Oh dear. Okay. Can you hear me okay? I'll take this thing off for this. Hopefully my lipstick's not smudged. Can you all hear me okay? Yep, okay. So it's my really deep pleasure to welcome you today to the second of our keynote speeches for this Sustainable Investment Forum. I'm really excited about the panel that I'm going to present to you today. If I take the time to reflect on the messages that I've heard over the last sort of 36 hours or 24 hours really actually, here at the World Forestry Congress, we've heard the world is in trouble. We have these multiple environmental challenges that are pressing and critical, and what are we going to do about it? And well, the time is now. We have to work on these now, but we know all of that. And we've heard forests are a critical part of the solution. And, as foresters, we all celebrate that, but we've known all of those things for a very long time. But I'm really excited about what I've heard earlier today, but also what I heard in some of the presentations yesterday. And these are the things that really keep me motivated from day to day. First of all, I think governments are more energised about the forest sector than perhaps I've seen them over the course of my career. And I think they increasingly know that we cannot reach climate goals without forests and forest products. And we had the wonderful speech earlier today from Minister Lee White from Gabon, which worked to that point. And then the private sector is creating sustainable investment vehicles that I think would have been unheard of just 10 years ago. And this whole day, we're celebrating innovative forest products in all parts of the globe. And while on this last point, we have work to do, I feel the role of communities and smallholders is increasingly being recognised as absolutely critical, and efforts are being made to improve the benefits that they receive from profitable forest investments. So to build on that momentum, I think we have an absolutely brilliant panel here with us today, each of whom is going to provide us with vision and insights to further guide the practical, innovative and transformative approaches that the forest sector can continue to use to realise its potential. And the people that we have with us, we'll have a video online from Mr. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, who is the CEO of the Global Environment Facility. But I'm most pleased to have with us today Sham Satkuru, who's the Executive Director of the International Tropical Timber Organisation, and Mokina Mekeka, who's a principal with Dalberg, and I've had the pleasure to work with in recent times. So before we get started, could I ask for the video from the CEO from the Global Environment Facility to go up on the screen, please?
Dear heads of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests, organizations and representatives of major groups, ladies and gentlemen, conserving healthy forests is not only possible, it is also an obligation we collectively need to assume if we want to maintain the ecosystem services and all forms of life needed to survive in this planet. The pandemic has been a stark reminder that the world was on the wrong track with the clash between economic systems and the natural world, causing a global zoonotic disease outbreak. For many decades, nature destructions and forest loss has been one of the main causes of biodiversity loss and has contributed significantly to climate change, land degradation, food insecurity, and poverty, affecting in particular the most vulnerable people living in or depending on forests and natural ecosystems. By considering the real and comprehensive value of forests and by promoting and implementing adequate policy reforms, we can redesign markets and deal with institutional failures that have led to deforestation and forest degradation. The approach needs to be integrated and inclusive to achieve the required transformation of economic systems. The Global Environment Facility has supported sustainable forest management since its inception more than 30 years ago, providing grants to implement projects on the ground in all the developing countries. Combating the biodiversity loss, climate change, and land degradation, the GEF project have included many different strategies, such as forest protection, forest restoration, community-based forest management, comprehensive land use planning in landscape approach, and sustainable use of natural resources. During the last 4 years, the GEF invested nearly $1.2 billion in forest-related projects. Building on this long experience and thanks to a record pledge of over $5 billion for the next funding cycle, the GEF will increase its support to forests notably through different integrated programs focused on the Amazon, Congo, and critical forest biomes, food systems, ecosystem restoration, and net zero nature positive accelerator. Forests continue to be at the heart of the GEF integration agenda going forward. It is in our next 4-year funding cycle that the GEF will be working to help countries set strong and coherent policies that can prioritize a green, blue, clean, and resilient future. For this future to happen, a particular focus on forests will need to recognize the importance and promote the conservation of primary forests and local communities' livelihoods. Safeguarding our forests, their rich biodiversity, and supporting the sustainable livelihoods of those who depend on them is central to this agenda. It's time to stop harming the planet and lean into activities that will heal it. I'm sure that the CPF, through its global scope, shared vision, and the complementarities of its members, is a critical ally of the global community to meet this goal. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks everybody. Now, before I hand over to our excellent keynotes here, I'd like to invite Ludwig Liagra from Rio Impact to share a few words with us. I've been working with Ludwig at, sorry, I didn't introduce myself earlier. I am Lyndall Bull and I'm a forestry officer at FAO, for those of you who don't know me. And I've been working with Ludwig for, must be nearly 2 years now, at FAO, or in collaboration with Ludwig for, on the topic of ecosystem restoration. And together with my colleague Pilar Valbuena, don't say that very well. Together we designed the program that you have today, and Ludwig is the chief author of the invited paper that we wrote to accompany the session, which you can find a copy of if you go into the session on the website of the World Forestry Congress. So I just invite Ludwig to give us some overarching words on, I guess, the vision and that we have for today's investment forum, and after that we'll move on to the keynotes. Thanks, Ludwig.
Thanks a lot, Lyndall, and great to be with you today. I think we have a small presentation. Great. Yeah, some food for thought for the session today. In fact, and I'm saying that under the control of our colleague Martin, who will speak later from UNEP, because we had a great study this year on the state of finance for nature that tells us we need to multiply by 3 the amount of financing needed for forest-based solutions by 2030, and even by 4 by 2050. So that's a huge challenge that we have in front of us. We need to get close to $200 billion per year by 2050. That's a lot. And how do we get there? How do we get there? Maybe you're going to see on the next slide how we can get there. On the next slide, so that's a little bit what Garo Batmanian was telling us today about these two sides of the same coin, the greening finance and the financing green. It's important to green finance, and we see very important initiatives. We saw today from the representative from UK, the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosure Initiative is very important. We have more and more financial institutions that green their financial practices with ESG standards, do no harm disclosure requirements, and so on. But we are still not there. If I really make this very simple, green finance would look like the small icons you have on the top today. Where are the trees? Where is biodiversity? It's there, but it's more addressed from the risk side approach, how to avoid harming biodiversity and forest. But how can we move the capital towards forest and biodiversity? I think that's the big question we already started to address today. The financing green. How do we finance more the nature-based solutions, the forest project, the biodiversity and pro-nature projects, so that green finance can look a little bit more like the image below, you know, with more trees and biodiversity. So on the next slide, we're going to think, how do we make that happen? How do we finance green much more prominently in the future? Well, we had already some answers today, but I think there are some drivers like we need to prepare many more investment-grade projects. We need more technical assistance facilities, project preparation facilities, you know, to help structure these bankable projects that we need. We also will have to invest more into guarantees, insurances, first loss equities, and so on, like risk mitigation tools and approaches. And working on blended finance models. We have some great GCF examples, GCF project examples like the Arbaro Fund. I think Yannick Lemarek mentioned this yesterday in his remark. From the GEF non-grants instruments as well, we've got the Landscape Resilience Fund that was launched last year. That is also a good example of how you can blend finance for these kind of tools. But of course, this will not be enough. The private sector and the finance world need to work closely with public institutions. We need more engagement of public institutions to frame these ESG standards, the sustainable finance taxonomy, the compliance markets for carbon, for example, but also providing these guarantees that we need into this blended finance model. So that's really a partnership work at the end of the day. But in the equation, and on the next slide, I think we need to not forget the vulnerable people and local communities, IPLC groups. Still, less than 2% of climate finance flows reach small farmers. That's the data from an IFAD study of last year. I think that's an alarming figure that we need to take into consideration very seriously. When we map the application of benefit sharing mechanisms for REDD+, for example, we can see all the countries in red and orange. So that's not to name and shame, but that's to give you a panorama of where the benefit sharing mechanisms are in design, already in operation, or not yet there. And we can see, okay, we have more work to do if we want to share well the benefits of RED+. We have more work to do also to implement the free prior informed consent, the mutually agreed terms with local communities. I think that's key. C4 ICRAF is building on a very powerful concept, I think, still for a few months, the stewardship economy. How can we make stewards at local level? How can local populations be empowered to become the stewards of their economy and become really the allies of the financial institutions, of the corporations, to really work together and succeed in this paradigm shift that we need? I think the Mondi scheme that we just saw with the small growers being supported by this Mondi scheme is an excellent example of that. On the last slide, I'd like just to remind us that forest is a key sector. Forest ecosystem services total economic value is $7.5 trillion US. We know that from the SOFO that was released yesterday. And with that perspective, we know that forest will play a key role to ecosystem restoration, to deliver on the biodiversity benefits, on climate benefits, both for mitigation and adaptation, will be a key ally for a bioeconomy from sustainably harvested wood and non-wood forest products and forest ecosystem services. So for all that reasons, we need to pay very close attention to what the forest sector can deliver. It has a lot to offer, for the paradigm shift we need, and I'm sure our distinguished speakers will lead us on ideas and ways that we can shape the future of forest investments. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ludwig. And if you liked what you heard, go to the page of the website for this session and you can have a look at the invited paper. We will also write an outcome statement for the investment forum, so in due course that will get uploaded as well. So yes, thank you, Ludwig. It is now my absolute pleasure to pass the floor to Shyam Satkuru, who's the Executive Director from the International Tropical Timber Organisation. Shyam, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lyndall. And can I say how privileged I am actually to be with all of you here. Shall I start again? Yeah. Thank you so much, Lyndall, for that nice introduction. And may I just say how privileged I am to be with you, to share our thoughts today, and congratulations also to the rest of the distinguished panel here who will complement what we're trying to achieve. Now, I come from this very small international organization called the International Tropical Timber Organization. We consist of 74 members, almost a 50-50 divide between producers and consumers. It was established approximately 39 years ago, and we are mandated under the International Tropical Timber Agreement of 2006, which is the third agreement since the organization was established. Now, being an intergovernmental organization, naturally, we are also a member of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests that Ludwig and Lyndall have already mentioned. We are one of the 15, by the way, and one of the smaller ones. Now, we work a lot together on forwarding the interests of the forest sector. And if I don't have to make it obvious, the International Tropical Timber Organization obviously is mandated on tropical forests in all 3 tropical regions in the world. So in other words, our membership covers 45% of global forests. So 45% of global forests are tropical forests. ITTO's tropical producing members out of the 74, they account for 80% of the global trade in forest and wood products. So that's a big number. Now, we saw from Ludwig's slide of the sad percentage of investment that has gone into the forest sector. Very sad. Barely 3%. But guess what? We all have that hope, because looking at how much the world is in trouble right now, particularly with climate challenges in terms of climate mitigation, adaptation, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and everything else that is attached to that, we have barely 8 years to go, and there is no better time and no better place for forestry at the moment. We are in the right spot to accelerate these investments. And of course, the whole point of my presentation today is just to give you a rough idea of what it is that we should be looking at. Now, please, as I go through my slides very, very quickly, please don't assume that I don't or ITTO does not support ecosystem restoration or the conservation of biodiversity. Those are absolutely key elements. But they've had a lot of attention over the last 3 decades, and attention in those sectors are always growing because it's one of those that people are attracted to. You know, human nature. They're naturally attracted to biodiversity, animals, flora, fauna. You talk about trees. Now, the foresters, I'm not a forester, but I love trees. So foresters also love trees. And when you look and talk about trees, you're not just looking and talking about trees, because those trees are part of these ecosystems. Those trees give those habitats the biodiversity possibility. Those trees help to manage that cycle of biodiversity evolution. Now I think I'll go on to the next. Now, with the GEF, thank you so much to the keynote from our GEF CEO earlier. They focus more on primary forests. ITTO does both. We focus on primary forests as well as production forests in our countries. So the production forests are an important element of what we are discussing here today, and it's also a key topic that's undergoing quite a lot of attention here at the World Forestry Congress. Now, these are the ITTO pilot programmatic lines, as you see them on the screen, and they're all there. We do the legal and sustainable supply chains, conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and forest landscape restoration and resilient livelihoods. We very much subscribe to everything that has been said in the session before this, session 3, if you were here to listen to that, and all the rest of the sessions that are complementing this investment theme. Emerging issues and innovation, of course, we need to keep our eyes open on anything new that can happen. The problem is this: a lot of the emerging issues are actually existing issues. It's just that they become emerging issues when it becomes like crisis level. Then the world wakes up. I'm sorry for being so frank, but this is what happens again because of it's just the way mankind reacts to different issues. Right, now, where are we? Let me see. The next one, please. Next slide, please. Or can I control that from here? No, I can't, right? No, can I have the next slide up, please? Okay, now this is the ITTO's Legal and Sustainable Supply Chains program, which will bring you to the actual topic that I think we should be looking more into, because not many people have actually looked into that. The Legal and Sustainable Supply Chains program naturally focuses on what it is. It's quite self-explanatory. All this will be your bedtime reading for tonight to find out a little bit more about this. You will also find the information on our website, www.itto.int. Everything is there. The next slide, please. The outputs of the LSSE program, of course, as you can see, we have done already a number of projects that have been successfully concluded. Some of them are ongoing, and they mainly focus on the value chains. Tracking mechanisms, we talked about data, we talked about the need to trace back, we talked about sustainable production. I'm going to take you to the next bit that tails on from sustainable production. Next slide, please. The outputs again, we involved and included incentive mechanisms. By incentives, I don't mean harmful subsidies. We all know, the whole world knows that they need to move away from that. And in coming up with legal and sustainable supply chains for the forestry sector, we need to have cross-sectoral complementary policies. The different sectors that occupy land, it's not just forests. We have forests, we have agriculture, we have farming, live farming. We also have mining. Let's not get into the technicalities of what lies above ground and what lies below ground. They all occupy land. They are land occupiers. All these sectors should be working complementarily to each other rather than seeing each other as enemies. And I think the IPCC is beginning to see that, because the last 2 reports, the penultimate report actually acknowledged that the use of wood products can help so much in climate mitigation and adaptation. Wood products as well as non-wood forest products, because forests play that multiple role. They're carbon sinks. They're sequesters. Use of wood products becomes perpetual carbon storage for the life of that wood product. We can't run away from that. That's a fact. It's a scientific fact. Next, please. So these are the studies that ITTO has conducted. Please take a very good look at them because they do give very good pointers on the do's and the don't do's, on the doables and the not doables. Next slide, please. And further, this is all the ITTO information that you can read for your bedtime reading. Next slide, please. We're a partner of the Sustainable Wood for a Sustainable World, together with the CPF. We have the FAO, and everyone else was involved in this. And it's a great move because you can see which SDGs it connects to. Forests fulfill practically all 17 of them, even the ones underwater, because that becomes our coastal regions. Next slide, please. So moving forward on the sustainable investments, I said sustainable strategic investments. I think you can still read the text on this as I speak, but please don't focus on reading what's on the slide, because I'll summarize that for you. The sustainable strategic investments basically means working with strategic partners, particularly those who have had live experience of successfully conducting scalable and replicable projects on the ground. So some of our small projects in the past, please don't forget the work that's been done over the 20 or 30 years ago. We don't need to reinvent the wheel on many things. We need innovation, yes, naturally, but the successful projects can be scaled up to fulfill all these big multi-trillion projects that the world is talking about. I'll be frank with you, ITTO has not seen them. We have no idea where those billions and trillions are flowing to. So some of our consuming members, of course, may have an idea because they actually contribute to these large funders. But what I wish to plead to all the donor communities is please also remember that the small projects can be bunched to make a big project. If you want a 50 million proposal tomorrow, we can come up with it. Not just ITTO, I'm sure our World Bank colleagues and our colleagues on this panel will work together with us. The second is the tropical timber industry also includes the forest industry. So it's quite wrong to just say tropical timber industry. I'm sorry, that was my bad because I didn't focus too much on the text myself. But that needs transformative investments. Again, here is multi-stakeholder process. Work with the parties who have done and have concluded these projects. And we need sustainable production and consumption. That's the bit that no one has really looked at. Production has been ongoing. The sustainable production and the implementation of sustainable forest management has been ongoing for the last 30 years. No one has been looking properly at the sustainable consumption. We need market measures that complement both supply and demand. Demand side alone is not going to solve the problem because in most cases, they are unilateral. Unilateral measures have no place, actually, in partnerships and collaborative work. Lastly, sustainable business development. Again, that will say what it is. And I stop there. Thank you very much.
Sham, that was just fabulous. Thank you so, oh, it was fantastic. Thank you so much. There's so many pieces of that we could pick up. But I mean, I'm 100% with you on so many points, but particularly our need to better promote and understand and invest in the issues around sustainable consumption and production. And that's something that occupies my days as well. So thank you. And now I'd like to move to our final keynote speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Mokena Makeka, who's a principal with Dalberg. Over to you, Mokena.
Thank you so much. Is this working? Yeah. Fantastic. A very difficult act to follow, I might say. Oh, but you do better. I want to thank all of the organizers for having me here. Thank you, colleagues, for the presentations and wonderful inputs. I'm looking forward to sharing with you some reflections, particularly looking at the African continent, and perhaps giving a slightly different lens in terms of how it's normally been perceived in relation to forest opportunity and forest economies. First slide, please. Okay, we can pause.
Or you could keep talking.
Yeah, yes, I can keep talking. So this presentation is really triggered by a number of reflections. One is understanding that historically the planet is facing a particular challenge with regards to economic development. And what we want to ensure is that no continent or no parts of the planet are left behind. In many respects, if we think of the first, second, or the third, or the fourth industrial revolution, many parts of the global south are still in the second industrial revolution, with limited access to water, secure energy, food security, etc. So the big dialogue has been in the thoughts of many people, which is when we talk about this transition towards a more equitable future that is also carbon-oriented, how do we begin to create the type of environments in which no continent is left behind? In this respect, I've been thinking and sitting down with a number of my colleagues at Dalberg and other organizations, WWF, FAO, World Economic Forum, etc., to say how can we imagine a different type of abundance by looking at Africa's contribution with regards to the climate-smart forest economy. So I'll give you some quick statistics. Between now and 2050, the African continent is expected to double in population. The implications of that are quite significant if you look at what does that mean with regards to green livelihoods. 40% of the world's major cities will be also within the African continent too. We talk about this demographic bulge or a demographic dividend. The challenge will be what are the type of construction solutions that will be required for the cities of the future? How will these future generations consume, as has been described by my colleague here? But also, what are the implications for Africa's existing forests, particularly with regards to understanding that there is a role for mass timber and the bioeconomy for economic development as a whole? So we began to draw some very strong conclusions that there are a couple of factors that we could take into consideration. Bioeconomy cities are the future. Go back one slide, please.
Are you sure you don't know the attitude that well?
No, actually, back to the beginning, and I'll go very quickly. Yeah. So this presentation, and I'll move forward given conscious of time. This is really about talking partly about the investment landscape of the African continent, but we can expand it larger to think about carbon in general. Next slide, please. So removing carbon at scale represents a significant opportunity for Africa and the world. I just want to make this very, very clear. Whether it's reforestation, afforestation, or various engineered solutions, Africa can be a viable destination for investment and for a different type of dialogue between the developed north and let's call it the more to developed south. Next slide, please. As I've mentioned before, these are the cities that are going to be growing significantly. There are many, many others, but the implication is that we have to start imagining how will these cities grow and evolve? What will it be like for these future generations? And what can we learn and take away? Because we certainly cannot build the city of the future in the way that we've built the cities of the last 2 centuries. That will only make things worse. Next slide, please. Now, forests can play a significant role. When we talk about bioeconomic policies or bioeconomic development, it's really about understanding the synergy between forest and urbanization. So gone are the days where you had a sort of hinterland along the edge of society and then cities and no dialogue between the two, but it's really about the integration between them. And there's a huge impact with regards to socioeconomic diversity, livelihoods, indigenous development. The statistic that Ludwig pointed out, I believe, about not enough capital going down to communities, particularly with regards to the formalization of some of these capital flows, I think is something we need to think about quite radically. Next slide, please. So Africa can and harness low emission production to enable its growth without dramatically increasing global emissions. In other words, our trajectory doesn't mean that because we're coming from a low emissions base, that we have to suddenly produce lots and lots of carbon and then eventually know how to go back down. So whereas other countries would say that we need to produce more carbon to develop, we as Africans are making the argument that we don't need to. In fact, there's an opportunity for us using our low emission profile as the means by which it can attract certain types of investment. So what are our endowments? We have the potential to engage with a whole new energy regime, ranging from renewables, etc. I mention this because very often when we talk about the future, we don't think about net zero. We always see forests or timber in isolation. I think it's important to think about the whole carbon continuum, energy, water, waste, etc., and say, what is the role of timber and forest within that broader spectrum of possibilities? Next slide. So Africa can serve growing global demand for low footprint products and services. And I do want to make one distinction here. What we don't want for the African continent is for it to become the place where carbon emitters decide to buy their credits on the continent and there's actually no change. So we do support the notion of carbon insetting, where organizations begin to look at their own carbon profile. But more importantly, when we talk about how Africa needs to develop, how can that expertise come down and how can we diversify the local economies in ways that are substantial? And most importantly, understanding that Africa on its own will have a huge market that will require these goods and services. And if we can reduce the distances for these goods, whether it's for building, construction materials, etc., it'll make for a better planet. Next slide. We've done some studies with an organization, the Climate Action Africa Platform, which is affiliated to Dalberg, Alongrise with Earthrise, and the UN Economic Commission for Africa, looking at what does this potential look like. At $50 per ton for carbon, which is actually the figure which correlates to understanding the social cost of carbon, so it's higher than the current figure of rough 20s that it might be, we're beginning to demonstrate real opportunities for impact across the continent. If we take that $50 per ton up to about the $80 to $100, which is expected to be over the next couple of years, there's significant impact. Now, what does this mean for forest? This means that we can radically reimagine how do we fund forests? How do we bring down the cost of afforestation? How do we bring down some of the costs that my good colleague mentioned in terms of forest management? We currently are not factoring the carbon economy enough into the way that we can make forests not only viable, but even attractive for us to create new forests. Because the other big question that we have to put onto the table is that between now and 2050, if we look at the growth and the requirement for fiber and various other wood products, we have to go onto a pathway where we begin to say, what are the sort of opportunities for biodiverse plantations? We simply can't work with the resources that we currently have. In fact, by many estimates, people say that forest cover, we've lost anything between 30 and 70%, depending on your estimation. So we actually have to radically, as a planet, think quite intensively about a planting approach and a planting regime, and what does that look like? Next slide. Now, all of these components are interrelated, and I think this is quite important. Carbon sinks, carbon storage, and carbon substitution. The role of the built environment in terms of keeping in carbon, the role of carbon storage, and the role of carbon sinks, which is essentially forest. Next slide. And some of you may have heard this phrase before, but my message to you all is that we need to create a bioeconomy Marshall Plan. This means that we need to think very much in terms about how do countries come together and aggregate their talents and resources and think in a regional fashion. I think there needs to be a sincere effort that we couple demonstration ventures, research, building a movement, and innovative finance in order to create this Marshall Plan, which will probably take us 10 to 12 years at least in order for us to transform the planet. Next slide. And that there are viable pathways that allow Africa's assets to contribute to this. Next slide. It is a market-driven approach that we believe that scalability is critical, and there are business models that show that new forest growth can begin to support the creation of cities, the creation of more opportunities and better safeguards. Next slide. And that countries that can proactively size, prioritize, and price viable opportunities for climate action in relation to forests will probably be the countries that will be best placed for the economy of the future. So essentially, this is a call to say that the private sector needs to participate and work with governments with regards to climate-smart forest economies, and that in order to create a bioeconomy Marshall Plan, we need more bioeconomic developmental policies from all nations. And I'm done.
Thank you, Mokena. And I asked for messages of inspiration, and I think I'm pretty confident in saying that you delivered. So thank you very much. Now, we have time for one question. Is there anyone from the audience that would like to ask a question? You're all very quiet. No? Okay. All right, I'm going to ask a question to one each for our panellists, and they're going to give me very fast answers. So, first to you, Sham. So, we talk a lot about this need for sustainable production and consumption, and I think you rightly pointed out that it doesn't get the attention that sort of deforestation and restoration receives. But equally, I think we do all struggle a little bit with how we communicate what sustainable production and consumption is and how an investor could make a difference on that front. Could you give us, I guess, maybe sort of an applied insight on how we perhaps might make progress on the sort of on the concept and implementation of sustainable consumption and production?
Thank you for that question, Lyndall. Thank heavens, Mokena had one slide that could really fit to explain that. It was potentially his second or his third last slide, okay?
I had to move quickly.
Yeah, so look at Mokena's presentation, because I don't have that slide with me, but also please listen to what I'm going to say next. What we also need are market measures, market incentive measures, in other words, for construction companies, so public-private partnerships in terms of using wood products in large construction projects, public construction projects. And I don't mean the whole building needs to be made of wood, no, right? What we need is a combination, panels or flooring or whatever it is, and there has to be an accounting system for that. If we can account for standing carbon in the forests, I don't see why it's so difficult to estimate consumption of cubic meters of wood that are being used in building and construction, right? So that part, that's one way of doing it. And there has to be consumption targets. Every time there are always production targets, or you need to be sustainably managed and certified, as in certified sustainable under one of the voluntary certification schemes by X, otherwise we shut our markets to you. No, that's not the way to go. Shutting the markets will only put those forests even more at risk because they're not returning a value, and what you get, increased degradation. They will shift it to another more economically viable land use. So market measures such as legality verification, independent certification, public procurement policies, private procurement policy targets, and government targets on mitigating and adaptation by increasing the use of forest and non-wood products. That's my answer. Thank you.
Thanks, that's excellent. Thank you. Okay, Mokena. One for you and you've got a minute. So, what is the one most impactful new nature-based investment solution that you would propose to the next UNFCCC COP that would make a transformative difference to our capacity to stay within 1.5 degrees and isn't a pledge that was made at the last COP?
Your question is longer than a minute, right? No, I actually would like to marry my answer to my colleague's point. I think we have to get to a point where, and I've probably said this before in maybe smaller forums, I would love at the next COP if every country made a commitment that 10% of all of their infrastructure spend for construction, and at least 50% of all state-sponsored construction, police stations, hospitals, clinics, whatever it might be, should be using nature-based solutions and predominantly using timber. I think that market signal would give assurances and comfort to the contracting industry. I think it would give off-take opportunities for forests who can now participate in the construction sector. And I think it would put a lot of pressure in terms of how we need to start to pivot the economy. So I do believe in the consumption point that my colleague made, that let's start perhaps modestly, but I would say that every country should commit 10% of their construction should be using nature-based solutions by 2025. And whatever solutions required will be locally specific, but that's what they must pursue.
Thank you very much. And with that, we're going to wrap it up, or I'm going to be very unpopular with Martin, who I'll invite up for the next session. So thanks, everyone. That was fabulous. Thank you so much.
Well done, thank you.
The presentation was amazing. I had to speak without slides for a good...
This was